There is a moment when you are standing on the edge of a cliff 800 meters above the North Atlantic, with the wind trying to push you off, and the fog rolling in from the west like a living thing, when you understand exactly why the ancient Norse sailors believed that beyond these islands, the world simply ended. Because standing here, it feels like it might. Below you, the ocean is not blue. It is black and green and violent, churning against the base of the cliff with a sound like distant thunder. And beside you, completely unbothered, chewing methodically, with the serene confidence of an animal that has never been afraid of anything in its life. A sheep is grazing 6 inches from the edge of an 800-meter drop. It does not look down. It does not look at you. It simply eats, because this cliff is its garden, and it has been eating here longer than you have existed. Welcome to the Faroe Islands. 18 volcanic islands rising from the North Atlantic, positioned between nowhere and nowhere else. Norway to the east, Iceland to the northwest, the open ocean in every other direction. A place so far from everything that the closest McDonald's is a 40-minute flight away. A country of 55,000 people and 80,000 sheep. To understand the Faroe Islands, you first have to understand the ocean that surrounds them, not the ocean as a concept, not the gentle, sunlit sea of holiday brochures, but the actual North Atlantic, in winter, in a storm, waves that reach 15 meters, winds that can knock a grown man sideways, swells that a fishing vessel rides up like a mountain, then falls down the other side into a green valley of water. This ocean is not a barrier between the Faroe Islands and the world. It is the world. Every meal, every job, every tradition, every story that defines life on these islands has been shaped by the sea that encircles them. The Faroese do not live beside the ocean. They live inside it, constantly aware of its moods, its demands, and the specific elemental respect it requires of those who depend on it. For 1,000 years, the fishermen of the Faroes have gone out onto this ocean in boats that grew from small wooden vessels to modern steel trawlers. But the essential relationship, one man, one boat, one enormous sea, has never changed. The ocean gives life here, and occasionally it takes it. And everyone who grows up on these islands understands, from childhood, which of the two forces is ultimately in charge. The landscape of the Faroe Islands operates on its own terms, indifferent to what humans want from it. In the space of a single afternoon, you can experience 4 entirely different weather systems: bright sunshine, horizontal rain, impenetrable fog, and violent gusts of wind. And none of them will have asked your permission to arrive. The locals do not check the weather forecast. There is no point. The forecast is always the same. Everything, in no particular order. What this weather has created, over millennia of wind and rain carving into volcanic basalt, is a landscape of extraordinary, almost violent beauty. Waterfalls drop directly from cliff edges into the ocean hundreds of meters below, falling so far that they break into mist before they hit the water. Lakes sit at the edges of cliffs, creating the optical illusion that they are floating in mid-air above the sea. Valleys are so green they look artificially colored, drenched by the 300 days of rain a year that fall on them. And in this landscape, the human settlements are almost invisible. The traditional Faroese houses are built low to the ground, their roofs covered with living grass, designed to blend into the hillside and resist the wind. From a distance, a Faroese village can look like a natural feature of the landscape, a cluster of dark wood and living green, as if the island itself decided to grow a few houses. The Faroe Islands have a population of 55,000 people. They also have approximately 80,000 sheep. This means that for every person on the islands, there is roughly 1.5 sheep. This ratio has been consistent for centuries because the Norse settlers who arrived in the 9th century found that the islands, while too cold and wet for most crops, were perfect for grazing. They brought sheep, the sheep thrived, and the islands were named in Old Norse. The Sheep Islands, Faroejar, and that name has stuck for 1,100 years. The entire country has exactly 2 traffic lights. Both are in the capital, Tórshavn, itself one of the smallest capital cities in the world, with a population of around 22,000. There are no motorways, no intercity trains. The islands are connected to each other by a combination of ferries, bridges, and, in the most dramatic engineering achievement in the country's history, a series of undersea road tunnels that burrow through the seabed between islands, allowing you to drive from one island to another as if going through a mountain. And there is no McDonald's, no KFC, no Starbucks. No global fast food chain has found it economically viable to open on an archipelago of 55,000 people in the North Atlantic. The Faroes, who are not known for false modesty, consider this a point of significant pride. They have their own food. They have had their own food for 1,000 years. They do not need the rest of the world's food. Getting around the Faroe Islands is an experience that recalibrates your sense of scale. The roads are narrow, sometimes barely wide enough for 2 small cars to pass, and they wind through landscapes so dramatic that you find yourself stopping every few minutes, simply because the view around the next corner has made it impossible to keep driving. Sheep are a constant hazard. They stand in the road with the authority of beings who were here long before roads existed. The villages are tiny. Most have populations in the hundreds. Some have fewer than 100 permanent residents. But they are not ghost towns. They are intensely alive, each with its own church, its own harbor, its own small cluster of houses that have been standing in the same configuration for generations. There is a specific quality of stillness in these villages that is entirely different from abandonment. It is the stillness of a place where nothing needs to be performed, and everywhere, wildlife. The Faroe Islands are home to millions of seabirds, puffins, gannets, guillemots, full Mars that nest in the cliff faces and fill the sky with their noise. The puffins, with their absurd, colorful beaks and their waddling walk, are both a tourist attraction and, in the Faroese tradition, a food source. They are hunted with hand nets on long poles, a practice so ancient that there are medieval illustrations of Faroese men doing exactly the same thing with exactly the same tool. The Faroese morning begins on the water. Before most of the islands are properly awake, the fishing vessels are already at sea, heading out into waters that can be fishing gold one day and killing fields the next. The fishing industry accounts for around 85% of the Faroe Islands' export revenue. It is not a side industry. It is the economy the single thread from which almost everything else hangs. Ashore, the fish processing plants begin their own rhythm. Salmon farming, done in the sheltered fjords between the islands, has transformed the Faroese economy in the last 30 years, turning what was a subsistence fishing culture into a global seafood exporter. Faroese salmon is eaten in restaurants from Tokyo to New York. The fjords that once saw Viking longships now hold floating fish farms producing hundreds of thousands of tons of salmon a year. For those not directly employed by the sea, the morning routine is remarkably ordinary. School runs, coffee, the local news. The Faroese capital has all the trappings of a small European city. Cafes, a university, a national museum, a football stadium. But step 10 minutes in any direction from the capital, and you are back in the fog, on the cliffs, among the sheep. The modern and the ancient coexist on these islands without apparent tension, as if they have simply agreed to share the space. Faroese food is not for the faint-hearted. The signature dish is skerpikjöt, mutton that has been hung to dry in the open air, exposed to the wind and the cold and the salt of the sea for anywhere from 5 to 9 months. It is not smoked, it is not salted, it is simply left outside, in a wooden shed with gaps in the walls, to be transformed by the Faroese wind into something between cured meat and aged cheese. There is also riced fiskur, fermented fish, and reister sæður, fermented lamb. The Faroese have a long tradition of fermentation, born from necessity. In a place with no agriculture and irregular fishing, you preserve what you have when you have it, in whatever way the environment allows. The result is a cuisine that is intensely, specifically local. The direct product of this landscape, this wind, this sea. But the Faroe Islands also have something unexpected. World-class contemporary cuisine. The restaurant K. Oaks, which operated on the islands for years before relocating, held 2 Michelin stars and was regularly cited among the best restaurants in the world. Its chef used the same local ingredients: lamb, fish, seabirds, wild herbs from the cliffs, but transformed them into something entirely contemporary. In the Faroes, the ancient and the cutting edge have always found ways to occupy the same kitchen. For most Faroese, work is still fundamentally connected to the sea, even if that connection is now mediated by technology. The modern fishing fleet is equipped with sonar, satellite navigation, and refrigeration systems that would have been incomprehensible to fishermen of a generation ago. But the fundamental knowledge, reading the weather, understanding the currents, knowing where the fish are and when, that is still passed down, person to person, the way it always has been. The salmon farming industry has created a new kind of Faroese worker, the aquaculture technician, the marine biologist, the logistics manager, whose job is to get fresh Faroese fish onto a plane to Tokyo within 24 hours of it leaving the water. This is a highly technical, globally connected industry operating from one of the most remote locations in Europe. The contrast is constant. Cutting-edge global commerce happening on islands where a sheep might walk into your office. And then there are the newer industries: technology, design, tourism that have grown in the last 2 decades. A generation of young Faroese who studied abroad have returned to build companies in software, in architecture, in the creative industries. The Faroe Islands have a faster average internet speed than most of continental Europe, delivered via undersea cable. Remoteness, it turns out, is not incompatible with connectivity. You can run a global business from an island with 2 traffic lights if you have a good enough cable under the ocean. Children in the Faroe Islands grow up with a freedom that is increasingly rare in the modern world. They play outside in all weather because there is no alternative, running across hillsides that their grandparents also ran across, climbing the same rocks that have been climbed by children for centuries. The islands are safe in the way that small, tight-knit communities are safe. Everyone knows everyone, and everyone's children are everyone's responsibility. The schools are small. Most village schools have fewer than 100 students across all age groups, and the education system is both intimate and internationally competitive. Faroese students learn Faroese, Danish, and English, and many go on to universities in Denmark, Iceland, or further afield. The question of whether they will come back is one that every Faroese family navigates. The islands need young people, but the world outside is large. For teenagers, the Faroe Islands present a specific kind of restlessness. In Tórshavn, there is a cinema, a music scene, a social life, but it is small, intensely small. Everyone your age knows you. Every mistake you make is public. Every success is celebrated by the whole community, which is wonderful when you succeed and suffocating when you fail. The teenagers who leave describe feeling like they could finally breathe. The ones who return describe missing something they could not name until they came back. The single most extraordinary piece of infrastructure in the Faroe Islands is invisible. You drive toward a mountain, through a dark portal, and suddenly you are underground. Deep under the seabed, in a tunnel bored through solid rock, driving on a road that runs beneath the ocean from one island to another. These tunnels, the Faroe Islands has several of them, are engineering achievements that seem entirely disproportionate to the size of the nation that built them. One of the tunnels contains what is believed to be the world's only underwater roundabout, a junction point beneath the seafloor where drivers choose which island to emerge on. It is used by thousands of people every day. Locals navigate it without a second thought. Visitors tend to stop their cars and take photographs, unable to quite believe that this is a real thing that exists. The more remote islands are connected by helicopter, a regular service that functions like a bus route, carrying passengers, mail, and medical supplies on a schedule. For people on the most outlying islands, the helicopter is not an emergency service. It is Tuesday's transport. It is the way you get to the doctor, visit your family, or do your shopping on the main island. Routine made extraordinary simply by the context. The weather in the Faroe Islands is not incidental. It is the central character of every story told on the islands. It shapes the architecture. Houses built low, facing away from the prevailing wind, with thick stone walls and grass roofs that insulate against both cold and storm. It shapes the schedule. Work plans are always provisional, always subject to what the weather decides to do. It shapes the psychology. A people who have lived in this weather for 1,000 years have developed a particular relationship with discomfort that borders on affection. But the Faroese weather is also capable of extraordinary beauty. When a storm clears, suddenly, without warning, as Faroese storms often do, The light that breaks through can be unlike anything in more temperate climates. The sky turns colors that seem to have been borrowed from somewhere else. Gold, violet, deep amber, a blue so saturated it looks like a painting. The islands, drenched and gleaming, reflect this light back from every surface. For a few minutes, the world is perfectly, overwhelmingly beautiful. In winter, on clear nights, which are rare enough to feel like gifts, the northern lights appear over the islands. The aurora borealis sweeps in curtains of green and white above the dark ocean, above the dark hills, above the dark houses where everyone is asleep. The light show runs for hours, watched by nobody, because everybody is warm inside. This is the Faroe Islands at its most characteristic. Something extraordinary, happening quietly, without audience. The Faroe Islands has the fastest average internet speed in Europe. This is not a coincidence. The government invested heavily in fiber optic infrastructure, precisely because digital connectivity was the only way to prevent the islands from being left behind economically as the world went online. A Faroese software developer can work for a company in San Francisco from a house that looks out over a waterfall falling into the sea. The juxtaposition has become the norm. The islands are also among the leaders in renewable energy. Wind and hydropower provide over 50% of the electricity, and there are ambitious targets to reach 100% renewable by 2030. Electric vehicles are everywhere, more per capita than almost any other country in the world. The same islanders who hunt puffins with medieval hand nets are also plugging in their Tesla before bed. And in the last decade, the Faroe Islands has become a filming destination for international productions, used as a stand-in for every wild, dramatic, fog-shrouded landscape that the modern screen demands. The islands that were once invisible on the world's cultural map are now recognizable to millions of people who have seen them without knowing where they were. This visibility brings tourism, and tourism brings its own complications. How do you welcome the world to a place whose power comes precisely from its exclusion from the world? In a country of 55,000 people, degrees of separation collapse to almost nothing. The Prime Minister of the Faroe Islands answers his own phone. The Minister of Finance shops at the same supermarket as everyone else. There is no celebrity culture here, in the sense of people being famous to strangers, because there are no strangers. Everyone is, at most, 3 handshakes from everyone else. This intimacy creates a specific kind of social obligation. When someone needs help, with a fishing boat, with a house repair, with childcare, during a crisis, the community responds with a directness and a speed that organized social services cannot match. It is not a nostalgic fantasy of rural community. It is a practical necessity. On a small island in a difficult ocean, the person beside you is your infrastructure. The clearest expression of this community bond is the chain dance, an unbroken tradition of group singing and dancing that has been practiced in the Faroes since the medieval period. Everyone joins the chain, young and old, fisherman and software developer, farmer and civil servant. The songs are long and repetitive, telling old stories of Viking raids and love affairs and battles. The chain forms and moves as one body for hours, and when it ends, everyone knows, without being told, something about what it means to belong here. daily life in the Faroe Islands has a specific, persistent inconvenience that affects almost everyone. The weather and the sea conspire constantly against predictability. A fishing trip planned for Tuesday may not happen until Friday because the sea said no. A medical appointment on another island may require rescheduling because the helicopter did not fly. A supply ship from Denmark that was supposed to arrive last week is still waiting in port in Esbjerg because a storm made the crossing impossible. And then there is the darkness. In winter, the Faroe Islands receive as few as 5 hours of daylight. The sun rises low on the southern horizon and sets again before you have had lunch. Combined with the fog and the cloud cover, there are weeks in January and February when you do not see direct sunlight at all. The Faroese have a word, mörk, meaning dark, that encompasses not just the absence of light, but a particular quality of heaviness that comes with the long winter. The persistent challenge is keeping young people. Every generation, a portion of the young Faroese who go abroad to study do not come back, absorbed into larger cities, into more diverse career markets, into the social variety that a population of 55,000 simply cannot offer. The Faroese government tracks immigration carefully and designs policies specifically to make return attractive. But the pull of the larger world is real, and the islands cannot offer everything. The question of what they can offer, and whether that is enough, is the central anxiety of Faroese social and political life. As the afternoon light fades, early, in the Faroe Islands, even in summer, the islands turn inward. The fishing boats that left in the morning begin to return. The processing plants shift to their evening operations, and in the small houses with their thick walls and their grass roofs, lights come on behind windows that look out at the fog and the sea. The social life of the Faroe Islands is intensely local and intensely convivial. People visit each other's homes. There are small bars in Tórshavn where the same faces appear night after night, where the conversation runs from football to politics to the price of salmon to what the Thorstegar wind is supposed to do next week. The intimacy of small community life that is suffocating for some is sustaining for others. The feeling of being known, of never being anonymous, of having a place that is specifically yours. And then, relatively early by the standards of larger cities, the islands go quiet. The fog settles over the cliffs. The sheep stand motionless in the dark hillsides. The ocean runs in the background like a constant, low note. In the morning, it will all begin again. The fishing boats, the wind, the impossible light, breaking through unexpected clouds over the Atlantic, and the sheep, already awake, already grazing, already completely unbothered by all of it. Ask a Faroese person what they are proudest of, and the answer will not be the scenery, though they will acknowledge the scenery with a certain quiet pride, like someone admitting that their home has good bones. The answer will be the language. Faroese is spoken by only about 75,000 people in the world, fewer speakers than almost any other recognized national language on Earth. It has been banned by colonial authorities, dismissed by linguists as a dialect, and repeatedly predicted to simply disappear. It did not disappear. It became instead a matter of identity so fierce that today there are Faroese language films, television series, pop music, and a thriving literary scene The survival of the Faroese language is not accidental. It required deliberate, sustained effort across generations. Scholars who collected and standardized the written form in the 19th century, teachers who insisted on using it in classrooms when Danish was the official language of instruction, parents who chose to speak it at home when switching to Danish would have been economically easier. This is what the Faroese are most proud of. Not what they have, but what they refuse to give up. And now, Faroese music is being heard far beyond the islands. Artists singing entirely in a language spoken by 75,000 people are amassing millions of streams on global platforms. The Faroe Islands has sent representatives to Eurovision in Faroese, naturally. The cultural output of a micronation that the world barely knew existed has become, improbably, a source of real fascination for audiences who cannot find the islands on a map. The fog, it turns out, makes excellent music. The world, when it thinks of the Faroe Islands at all, tends to think of photographs. The photographs are extraordinary. The floating lake, the waterfall into the sea, the cliffs covered in thousands of puffins. And they have circulated so widely on social media that the Faroes have become, for a certain type of traveler, a destination to collect, to visit, photograph, post, and move on to the next wild and remote location. The Faroese have a complicated relationship with this attention. Tourism has grown rapidly in the last decade, bringing economic benefit, but also strain on the narrow roads, on the fragile ecosystems around the most popular viewpoints, and on the specific quality of life that makes the islands worth visiting in the first place. The government has implemented periods of voluntary closure of certain natural sites, asking tourists to stay away while local volunteers maintain and restore the paths. The response, globally, was largely sympathetic, which suggests that the world, when asked correctly, can be taught to visit places with a little more care. The other misunderstanding is about the Grindadrap, the traditional pilot whale hunt. Every year, when pods of pilot whales are spotted near the islands, the community organizes to drive them into shallow bays and slaughter them. The images are viscerally disturbing. The water turns red. The beach fills with dead whales, and they have made the Faroes the target of passionate international protest. What outsiders often miss is the context. The whales are not sold commercially. The meat is distributed equally to all participants and to the local community. It has sustained the islands through centuries of food insecurity. Whether that context justifies the practice is a genuine moral question. But it is a different question from the one most protesters are asking. Ranva is 63 years old and has lived in the same house, in the same village, her entire life. The house looks out at the same bay her father and grandfather looked out at, and before them, people whose names she knows from the church records and from the stories her grandmother told. She has Copenhagen, once to New York, to Spain on a summer holiday. Each time, she came back. Not from a failure of imagination, but from a very clear-eyed decision. What she came back to was specific. The way the fog lies in the valley in the morning. The sound of the stream behind the house. The neighbors, whose names she has known since before she could read. Her husband's grave on the hillside above the village, visible from the kitchen window. These are not abstractions. They are the precise material of a life, accumulated over 60 years, and no apartment in Copenhagen could hold them. She teaches her grandchildren the old songs, the ones from the chain dance, the ones that her own grandmother taught her. The children listen with the divided attention of children who also have screens and headphones and the entire internet. But they listen, and occasionally Ranva catches one of them humming an old melody while they are doing something entirely unrelated. She considers this a success, not a triumph, just the quiet, daily work of keeping something alive. Jakob left the Faroe Islands at 18 to study computer science in Copenhagen. He stayed for 9 years, studied, worked, built a career in software development, lived in a flat in Frederiksberg with 2 other Faroese expats who had also stayed longer than they planned. He was earning well, the city was stimulating, and every Christmas, when he came home for 2 weeks, he felt the specific pull of the islands like a physical thing. When the pandemic made remote work universal, Jakob left Copenhagen and came home. What he discovered was that his entire job, designing software for a company based in Amsterdam, was completely unaffected by his location, as long as he had a reliable internet connection. The Faroe Islands had excellent internet. He had his salary. He had the view from his parents' house, looking out at the fjord. He has not gone back to Copenhagen. He is not alone. A quiet but significant reverse migration has brought a number of young Faroese professionals back to the islands in the last 5 years, drawn by the combination of remote work flexibility and the specific quality of life the islands offer. They have started companies. They have built the beginnings of a tech sector. They have turned what the islands lack, scale, density, the buzz of a major city, into assets, quiet focus, space to think. The Faroes may be about to discover that its greatest vulnerability, its smallness, was also always its greatest strength. The traditional knowledge is thinning. The specific skills required to live a traditional Faroese life, to build the wooden drying sheds for the mutton, to read the ocean by its color and its smell, to know which cliffs hold what birds in which season. These were once common knowledge, passed from parent to child as naturally as walking. Now they exist in a narrower and narrower group of older people. There are old fishermen who can navigate in fog by the sound of the waves against specific rocks, who know that a certain behavior of the guillemots means a storm is coming in 6 hours, who can look at the sky at dawn and predict, with reasonable accuracy, what the afternoon will bring. This knowledge is not written down anywhere. It lives in people, and when the people are gone, it will simply not exist anymore. The food traditions are also changing. Fewer households now prepare the traditional fermented foods, the hanging mutton, the rest fiskur, that defined Faroese cuisine for centuries. The younger generation largely prefers fresh food, global cuisine, the same things available in any European city. The old methods survive in restaurants and in the households of the most traditional families as a cultural statement rather than a daily necessity. Whether that is preservation or museumification is a question that the Faroese themselves are still working out. For a young person growing up in the Faroe Islands today, the dilemma is both older and sharper than it has ever been. Older, because every generation since the islands were settled has faced the same pull, the world outside is larger. Sharper, because the world outside is now available on a 6-inch screen in your pocket, 24 hours a day. You do not need to leave to see what you are missing. You can see it constantly, in real time in high definition. Social media has made geography psychological. A teenager in a village of 300 people on the Faroe Islands is now simultaneously a member of global youth culture, following the same trends, listening to the same music, watching the same shows as teenagers in London and Seoul and Sao Paulo. The disconnect between the life available online and the life available locally is, for some, a source of excitement. They are connected to something larger. For others, it is a source of a specific, persistent discontent. But something else is also happening. The same generation that is most exposed to the global world is also, paradoxically, the most interested in what makes the Faroes specifically and irreducibly itself. Young Faroese people are studying their own language, their own music, their own history, with an intensity that previous generations, who took these things for granted, never needed to muster. Identity becomes precious when it feels threatened, and the Faroese identity, for the first time in its history, feels slightly threatened. The G Festival, held every July on the island of Syðrugøta, is proof that the Faroe Islands can do something most places only dream of. It can combine world-class music with world-class scenery, and a community atmosphere that no urban festival can replicate. Bands play on a stage at the edge of a fjord, with mountains behind and ocean in front, to an audience of a few thousand people who know every other person in the crowd. But the cultural event that matters most to the Faroese themselves is more ancient. The Olavsoka national holiday, held on the 29th of July each year, the feast day of Sant Olavur, is when the chain dance comes alive in the streets of Tórshavn. It begins in the evening and runs through the night, sometimes for 8 or 10 hours, as the chain grows and shrinks, as old songs end and new ones begin, as generation after generation joins the same circle and moves together, telling the same old stories with their bodies. To watch the chain dance is to understand something about the Faroe Islands that no amount of statistics or scenery can convey. It is a living thing, an unbroken thread running from the medieval period to tonight, through every generation that has ever stood on these islands in the dark, and chosen to hold the hand of the person beside them. In a world that is forever finding new ways to be alone, this ancient insistence on togetherness is quietly radical. There is one time of day in the Faroe Islands when even the wind stops. It happens sometimes in the hour before dawn, a brief, inexplicable pause in the constant movement of air that gives the islands their character. In that pause, the fog lies perfectly still over the valleys. The ocean, visible from the hillsides, moves in slow, heavy swells without breaking. The only sound is water, a stream, a waterfall, rain dripping from the grass roofs. If you are awake for this moment, and if you have gone to bed at a reasonable hour, you probably will be, because the Faroes do not offer much nightlife before 5 a.m. There is something available in that silence that is difficult to name. It is not emptiness. It is more like the feeling of being held. The landscape around you, which has been active and dramatic and demanding all day, is momentarily still, and in that stillness, it reveals something different. a quality of depth that the perpetual wind had been keeping hidden. Then the wind returns. It always returns. The fog begins to move again. The first birds call from the cliff, and the islands resume their normal posture, magnificent, relentless, absolutely indifferent to whether you are watching. Which is, perhaps, exactly the point. Living in the Faroe Islands teaches a lesson that most of the modern world has lost access to, the lesson of sufficiency. Not poverty. The Faroes are, by any objective measure, a wealthy society. But sufficiency in a deeper sense, the experience of having what you need, in a place that asks nothing more from you than your presence and your participation. There is no traffic jam in the Faroe Islands, no anonymity, no hour-long commute, no queue at a coffee shop. The sources of daily friction that most urban people have come to accept as simply the cost of modern life are absent here, and their absence creates a kind of spaciousness in time, in attention, in the quality of the days. People notice things here. They notice the weather. They notice each other. They notice the specific quality of the light on the water at 4 in the afternoon in October, which is something that only someone with space in their attention can notice at all. The oldest Faroese will tell you that the islands used to be harder than this, that there was real hunger, real cold, real danger in the winters, before the fish processing plants and the ferry routes and the undersea tunnels arrived. They do not romanticize that hardship, but they will say, without exception, that the people who lived through it had something that the comfortable modern world struggles to supply: an unambiguous sense of purpose. You knew what your day was for. It was for surviving, and for helping others survive, and that was enough. The central question of the Faroe Islands is the one we have been circling all along. Why do people stay? Or, more precisely, why do some people come back? When leaving is so easy now, when the world is so available, when a career and a social life can be built almost anywhere. Why do people choose a place that has 8 months of fog, 2 traffic lights, and more sheep than people? The answer is different for each person, but it has a common shape. It is the answer that comes from knowing a place so deeply, its seasons, its moods, its specific beauties and specific difficulties, that you cannot quite imagine being fully yourself anywhere else. It is the answer that comes from belonging to a community, small enough that your absence is noticed, your return is celebrated, and your contribution is genuinely needed. And it is the answer that comes from the landscape itself. There are places in the world that are beautiful in a way that you can appreciate, and then leave. And then there are places that get into you, that rearrange something in your interior landscape to match themselves, so that afterwards you carry them around and find yourself in the middle of an ordinary day in an ordinary city, thinking about the sound the wind makes when it comes over a certain ridge, or the color the water turns just before a storm. The Faroe Islands is one of those places. People know this from the first time they experience it. And knowing it is enough to bring some of them back, life in the Faroe Islands is expensive. Almost everything must be imported, either from Denmark by ship or from the international market by plane. Food costs significantly more than in mainland Europe. Consumer goods are more expensive. The logistics of running a life on a remote archipelago add a premium to everything from a new car to a packet of coffee. And there is the isolation. Not the romantic isolation of a weekend retreat, but the sustained isolation of a life lived at a distance from the majority of the world. For those who need variety, who need the stimulation of large cities, who need to be among many different kinds of people, the Faroes can be genuinely difficult. The community's intimacy, which is a gift when you need support, is a constraint when you need privacy or anonymity, or the freedom to be someone new. The social pressure of a small community is real and should not be romanticized. When everyone knows your business, when every failure is public and every personal difficulty is community knowledge, the weight can be significant. Some people leave not because they don't love the place, but because they need to be somewhere they are not already known. Somewhere they can build themselves without the accumulated history of childhood following them. This is a legitimate need, and it is one that the Faroe Islands, for all its virtues, cannot fulfill. The Faroe Islands exists in a peculiar geopolitical space. It is part of the Kingdom of Denmark, but it is not part of the European Union, even though Denmark is. It has its own parliament, its own tax system, its own passport, its own language, its own football federation. Its team plays in FIFA and UEFA separately from Denmark. But it is not fully independent because defense, foreign policy, and certain legal matters remain Danish responsibilities. This arrangement suits most Faroese most of the time. There is a periodic independence movement, which gains strength when the economy is good, and the Faroese feel confident and retreats when global uncertainties remind people that being sheltered by a larger state has practical advantages. The question of full independence is not settled, and it generates genuine debate about identity, about economics, about what sovereignty means for a nation of 55,000 people in the middle of the North Atlantic. The relationship with the outside world is also economic. The fishing rights in Faroese waters are a source of ongoing negotiation with the EU, with Norway, with Iceland. The salmon export market depends on global trade relationships. The tourism industry depends on air connections and international marketing. For a place that feels so self-contained, the Faroe Islands is actually deeply embedded in global systems. Its isolation is geographical, not economic. The Faroe Islands has set itself an audacious goal: to be the world's first fully renewable archipelago, producing 100% of its energy from wind and water by 2030. The hydroelectric plants already work with the island's extraordinary rainfall. The wind turbines are multiplying on the hillsides. The government has committed to retiring its last fossil fuel power station on a specific date. This ambition is characteristic of a specific Faroese trait: the willingness to do things at scale that should, by all logic, require more people and more resources. They built undersea road tunnels. They laid fiber optic cable across the seabed. They created a world-class salmon industry from scratch. When the Faroe Islands decides to do something, the smallness that might seem like a limitation turns out to be an advantage. There is less inertia, less bureaucracy, fewer competing interests. A country of 55,000 can change direction faster than a country of 50 million. And the children of the Faroe Islands are growing up with all of this as their normal, the renewable energy, the global connectivity, the fierce pride in their language and their traditions, the understanding that small does not mean powerless. The generation coming of age here has inherited an unusual gift, a place that is simultaneously ancient and cutting edge, local and globally connected, wild and technologically sophisticated. What they will make of that inheritance is the most interesting question the islands have ever asked. The Faroe Islands refuses to be reduced to a single story. It is not simply a remote paradise. It is a functioning, complicated society with social tensions, economic anxieties, and genuine political debates. It is not a museum of Viking heritage. It is a place where people are working in tech startups and salmon farms and sending their children to universities in Copenhagen and Berlin. And it is not a tragedy of isolation. It is a place where people are, in remarkable numbers and with evident intention, choosing to be. What the Faroe Islands does, more effectively than almost anywhere else, is make visible the choices that modern life usually hides. When you live in a city of millions, the decision to be there is invisible. You are simply in the flow, moving with the current. When you live on an island of 55,000 in the North Atlantic, the decision is constant and explicit. Every day, you are choosing this: the fog, the wind, the intimacy, the beauty, the constraint. And the people who make that choice, year after year, tend to make it with a clarity and a deliberateness that is itself a kind of wisdom. There is something the rest of the world might usefully borrow from the Faroe Islands, and it is not the landscape. Though the landscape is extraordinary, it is the question of what a life is for, of what a place can give you and take from you, of what you are willing to trade for what. The Faroese live with that question consciously, because their circumstances have never allowed them to forget it. The rest of us might try asking it a little more often. Late afternoon. The light has finally decided to cooperate, breaking through the clouds in the west and laying itself across the ocean in long, golden bars. The cliffs on the western coast are lit from the side, every fold of rock and grass shadow sharp and clear. A flock of sheep moves slowly across the hillside above, indifferent to the beauty as only the perpetually surrounded by it can be. In the village below, lights are coming on in the windows of the houses. Smoke rises from one chimney. A dog barks once and is quiet. The ferry from the neighboring island is visible on the water, a small white shape making its ordinary crossing, carrying its ordinary cargo of people returning home from their ordinary day. The mountains behind are blue with distance. The ocean in front is gold with the last of the light. A man stands on the path above the village, not moving, just watching. He has seen this view thousands of times. He will see it thousands of times more if he is lucky. And every time, he will tell you this if you ask. It is different. The light is never quite the same. The clouds are always rearranging. The sea is always a different shade of impossible. In a world that is accelerating faster than most of us can follow, there is something here that does not accelerate. Something that is simply here, as it has always been, waiting for whoever needs it to stand still for a moment. And here, at the edge of the Atlantic, at the edge of the world, standing still is the most natural thing imaginable.